hello, neighbor. So nice to see you again. You didn't think I was gonna come to that door singing a song, did you? Oh, well, sorry to disappoint. Maybe I can make it up to you, though, by regaling you with more strange and unusual tales from Hollywood Graveyard. Yeah? Good. Well, have a seat. Get comfortable. Let's make the most of this spooky night. See what kind of bizarre tales we can unearth in the cemeteries of the world. Won't you please join me? Let's see now, where did I put that dusty old book? Ah, here it is. Right, then, where to begin? Oh, I know. In part one of our strange and unusual tales, we began with stories of individuals who were not granted that final wish of so many a loved one, to rest in peace. Let's begin today by exploring some more stories of disturbed slumber. There are few bigger names in the history of entertainment than that of Elvis Presley. So let's kick off our explorations today at Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee, the home of Elvis when he was alive and after he died. But this wasn't the King's original resting place. No, after Elvis's untimely death in 1977 at just 42, he was originally entombed in the mausoleum at Forest Hill Cemetery, just a few miles north of here, and not far from where his mother Gladys had been laid to rest. But days later, 3 men were arrested in an attempt to steal Elvis's body. They reportedly had planned to use dynamite to blast into the mausoleum. In the wake of the attempt, the family was able to secure the permission they had originally sought to allow Elvis to be buried on the grounds of Graceland. So 1 month later, both Elvis and his mother were exhumed and reburied at Graceland. On the grounds, you'll also find the original marker that had stood on his mother's grave at Forest Hill Cemetery, and you'll also find the graves of his family, including his parents, daughter, and grandson. Michael Todd was a theater and film producer known for his 1956 production of Around the World in 80 Days, which won an Academy Award for Best Picture. He's also known for his marriage to actress Elizabeth Taylor. Todd's life was cut short in 1958 when he died in a plane crash. He was initially laid to rest here at Waldheim Cemetery in the Chicago area, but years later, Todd's remains were desecrated by grave robbers. The thieves dug him up and broke into his casket, looking for a valuable diamond ring, which, according to legend, he had been buried with. The bag containing Todd's remains was found under a nearby tree and was later reburied in a secret location. Fans of Southern rock well know the name Leonard Skinner, and I'd wager just about everyone out there has heard their song, Sweet Home Alabama. But there's a tinge of sadness that comes along with listening to their music, particularly Freebird, recalling that several members of the band died in a plane crash in 1977. Vocalist Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, and backing vocalist Cassie Gaines died in the crash and were buried here at Jacksonville Memory Gardens in Florida. But decades later, vandals broke into the tombs of Van Zant and Gaines. In the early morning hours of June 29, 2000, the unearthed casket of Ronnie Van Zant was discovered on the grounds, and nearby a plastic bag containing Steve Gaines's urn was also found. Because of this, Steve's remains were relocated to a secret location, and Ronnie was reburied at Riverside Memorial Park in Jacksonville, first near his parents, then years later, in 2022, Ronnie was moved once again to his third grave at this scenic location near the lake. It's not just famous entertainers whose afterlives can be a bit rocky. Even presidents can experience post-mortem upheaval, like Abraham Lincoln. The man who held the United States together during the Civil War and freed the slaves was assassinated on April 15, 1865. But it wouldn't be until 1901 that Lincoln was finally, permanently laid to rest. And over those many years, Lincoln's coffin would be moved 17 times and opened 5 times. After the president's death, Mary Lincoln decided that Abe would be laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. His coffin was placed in this receiving vault from May to December of 1865, while construction began on his permanent monument. He was then moved to another temporary vault until 1871. Then he was moved into the partially completed tomb. In 1876, thieves attempted to steal the body of Lincoln, but only managed to partially lift it. In the years that followed, Lincoln would be moved to various secret locations a number of times in response to threats. A few times during these upheavals, his coffin was opened just to ensure he was still in there. In 1887, he was placed in a newly built vault, encased in concrete, and for a time it seemed that was final. It wasn't. By 1900, the tomb and monument were in need of some repair, so Abraham Lincoln was exhumed and temporarily reburied in a vault dug into the hillside behind the monument. In 1901, he was exhumed once again and placed in the new tomb, permanently this time, in a steel cage and embedded in concrete, 10 feet below this spot. Before his final entombment, his coffin was opened one last time to make sure he was still in there. Lincoln, who was the first president to be embalmed, was still perfectly recognizable, more than 30 years after his death. Did you see our short film, The Tomb of Nosferatu? Well, there's a disturbing story behind one of those graves. F.W. Murnau was the pioneering German director who made the landmark vampire horror film Nosferatu in 1922. Murnau died in a car accident in California in 1931 at just 42. He was laid to rest back in his native Germany, here at the Südwestkirchhof-Stahnsdorf Cemetery outside of Berlin. One morning in July 2015, the caretaker was making his rounds when he noticed the crypt of Murnau had been opened. Upon investigating, he discovered that Murnau's casket had also been pried open, and most disturbingly, the head of F.W. Murnau was missing. It had been stolen. On the floor of the crypt were traces of candle wax, as if some ritual had been performed in the removal of the skull. As of filming, the skull of F.W. Murnau has yet to be recovered. Speaking of vampires, America had something of its own vampire panic in 19th century New England. Tuberculosis claimed the lives of many in that era, and a lack of understanding of the disease mixed with the superstition of the era led some to blame supernatural forces. Mercy Brown was among those who died from the disease in 1892 at just 19. But after her death, townsfolk began claiming to see her wandering the cemetery. And her brother Edwin, who recently had contracted tuberculosis, claimed Mercy was sitting on his chest, suffocating him. It was decided that Mercy would be exhumed to investigate her body. Upon opening her coffin, observers noted she exhibited few signs of decomposition, looking very much still alive. And while this was because her body had been stored in freezer-like conditions before interment, those present concluded she must be a vampire. So they cut out her heart and burned it. The ashes were then mixed into a tonic and served to her brother Edwin to drink to try to heal him. The tonic obviously did nothing, and Edwin died a short time later. Mercy's desecrated corpse was then reburied here. Chapter 2. Dedicated to individuals whose final resting places number 2 or more. These folks are literally resting in pieces. And they could never tear us apart. Let's start right here in Los Angeles, at Forest Lawn in the Hollywood Hills. Michael Hutchence was an Australian musician, the frontman of the popular 80s new wave band In Excess. They had a string of hits like Devil Inside, Never Tear Us Apart, and Need You Tonight. Michael took his own life by hanging at age 37. After his death, he was cremated, his ashes divided into thirds. One portion of his ashes was interred here by his mother at Forest Lawn. Another third was scattered in Australia by his father, and another third went to his partner Paula, which she slept with in a cushion next to her. There is a second grave to Michael Hutchence in his homeland of Australia, but this is a cenotaph as there are no remains here. Classical music is a very serious, sophisticated, and highbrow art form. No room for silliness here, unless you're Victor Borge. No one did the hilarious juxtaposition of classical music and stand-up comedy better than the Great Dane, the Clown Prince of Denmark, Victor Borge. With his strong connections to both the United States and his native Denmark, after his death at age 91, Victor Borge had his ashes separated between the two sites. He has one grave here in Connecticut at Putnam Cemetery, which features the iconic Danish statue of the Little Mermaid, and another grave in Copenhagen at the Western Jewish Cemetery alongside his parents. Evelyn Keyes was an actress best remembered for her role as Sue Ellen O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, Susan in The Prowler, and Babs in 1001 Nights. After her death at age 91, Evelyn was cremated. A portion of her ashes went to relatives, and another portion was buried here at Waco Baptist Church Cemetery in Georgia. But before her death, Evelyn made another request. At the Museum of the Gulf Coast is a shrine to Evelyn Keyes. Inside is a replica of the genie lamp from her film 1001 Nights. Per her request, another small portion of her ashes was placed inside this lamp. I wonder, if you rub the lamp, do you suppose the ghost of Evelyn Keyes will appear? Let's hop the pond and voyage to London, England, and the University College of London. This unusual tale concerns one Mr. Jeremy Bentham, a noted English philosopher, jurist, and social reformer who had connections to this university. After his death in 1832, Bentham donated his body to the university for dissection and public display. On campus is a cabinet with Jeremy Bentham's name on it. I wonder what's inside. Why, it's Jeremy Bentham himself. That is what he called his auto icon. This is Jeremy Bentham's skeleton, dressed in his best attire, seated on his favorite chair, and padded out with hay. The head is wax, though. His real head used to be here, but it kept getting stolen by students as a prank, so it was removed and locked away elsewhere on campus. In 2022, Bentham's auto icon was put into a new glass display in the UCL's Student Center. For our next unusual tale, we team up with fellow YouTuber and friend of Hollywood Graveyard from Ireland, Serenity Sue. This is St. Peter's Cathedral in Drogheda. Here we remember St. Oliver Plunkett, Archbishop of Armagh, Primate of Ireland. The anti-Catholicism laws of the 1600s forced him into hiding and to perform Mass in secret. He was eventually arrested and imprisoned behind this actual door. Oliver Plunkett was convicted of high treason for promoting the Roman faith, and later hanged, drawn, and quartered. He would be the last Catholic martyr to die in England. After his death, his remains were initially buried at St. Giles in the Fields Church before being relocated to a monastery in Germany. Later, his head was removed and brought to Rome, and eventually made its way here to Drogheda, where you can see the head of Oliver Plunkett here in this towering shrine at St. Peter's. Nearby in this same church is a reliquary with more of Plunkett's bones. The rest of his body is divided between monasteries in England and Germany. What is posthumous execution? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's executing someone after they're already dead. Obviously a mostly symbolic gesture. The great English statesman Oliver Cromwell would be one of the most notable recipients of a posthumous execution. After his death in 1658 from sepsis caused by a urinary infection, he was buried with great ceremony at Westminster Abbey. 2 years later, the political winds in England shifted, and the monarchy was restored, making Cromwell persona non grata. His body was exhumed from Westminster Abbey along with 2 others and hanged from gallows for several hours before being beheaded in a posthumous execution for their roles in the overthrow of King Charles I. Cromwell's head was then placed on a spike on the roof of Westminster Abbey and his body buried elsewhere. The head remained atop Westminster Abbey for decades before apparently being blown off during a storm. The head then passed through the hands of a series of private collectors before finally being buried at Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge in 1960. Posthumous execution. That is bizarre. Oh, what this? It's chocolate. I have a terrible sweet tooth. And if you do too, this next one's for you. One can work up quite an appetite while grave hunting, especially when that appetite is triggered by the very graves you're visiting. Like when I visited the grave of Ghirardelli in San Francisco. Or if you're visiting the tastiest sounding cemetery in the world, Hershey Cemetery, which if you've never been to, you might imagine looks something like this. Here you might start craving a Hershey bar at the grave of Milton Hershey, founder and namesake of Hershey's. Or my kryptonite, a Reese's peanut butter cup, at the grave of the man who created them, H.B. Reese. After a much-needed trip to the dentist, perhaps you find yourself visiting Mount Calvary Cemetery in Salt Lake City. While there, say hello to William Turnier. Engraved right into his tombstone is an Oreo cookie. Why? Because while working for Nabisco, William Turnier gave the Oreo cookie its famous design. Have you ever wondered where flavors go when they die? Neither have I, but Ben & Jerry's knows. On the grounds of the Ben & Jerry's headquarters in Vermont is a flavor graveyard, where flavors of their famous ice cream that were discontinued have been laid to rest, with tombstones and all. Are there any flavors among these that you are mourning? Life isn't only about the sweet, though. We must enjoy the savory, too. Like tacos. Do you love tacos? Yes? Well, do you love tacos enough to make it your epitaph on your grave? Los Angeles food critic Jonathan Gold did, writing "Tacos Forever" on his tombstone here at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. If not tacos, maybe hot dogs are more your flavor. And here in America, few names conjure up images of the classic American hot dog more than Oscar Mayer. The man whose name has become synonymous with wieners founded his company here in Chicago in 1883, and now rests at this site at Rose Hill Cemetery. The success of that name recognition is owed in no small part to a catchy tune and distinctive marketing vehicle, the Wienermobile, which adorns this grave in Calumet Park Cemetery in Indiana. Here rests a man known as Little Oscar. George Molchan was the spokesperson for Oscar Mayer for nearly 4 decades, traveling the country in the Wienermobile to promote Oscar Mayer products. At his funeral, the Wienermobile was parked nearby, and mourners broke into a rendition of "I Wish I Were an Oscar Mayer Wiener." Have you ever eaten something that was so good, you asked if you could get the recipe, and the response was, "Over my dead body"? Well, these next masters of their culinary craft took that literally, by putting their favorite recipes right on their tombstones. In Brooklyn's historic Greenwood Cemetery, you'll find Naomi Miller Dawson's grave, and her recipe for Spritz cookies, a kind of buttery sugar cookie, particularly popular around Christmas time, and notable for their decorative shapes. Christmas cookies have the added ingredient of nostalgia baked into them, and so it's no surprise to find another Christmas cookie recipe on a tombstone. At Cascade Protestant Cemetery in Iowa, Maxine Menster's family shared one of her Christmas traditions with the world, etching their favorite recipe for her Christmas cookies onto her tombstone. In Utah's Logan Cemetery, we find another person who loved to bring her family together through good food. Wanting something on her stone that was meaningful to her, Catherine Andrews decided to have her famous fudge recipe engraved into her stone, to share it with the world. And she would be delighted to know that thanks to the internet and social media, people from all over the world have indeed tried her fudge. In recent years, it's become a popular trend on social media to make and share tombstone recipes. Boy, this is some really good tombstone fudge. While I continue to enjoy this, why don't you enjoy some more of those unique and unusual tombstones, monuments, and epitaphs? Those who know me know that I love stained glass. This is the first time I've ever seen a headstone made of stained glass. Sometimes a good laugh can be cathartic in the face of death, and I think Janet Girolamo knew that. If you guessed this was a Utah grave, you're wrong. Santa Monica, actually. If you find yourself wandering Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, you might just stumble onto a tombstone with a Ouija board carved into it. That's because the man who invented it in 1890 rests under it, Elijah Bond. The board is touted as a means of communication with the spirit world. So while we're here, let's pull out our planchette and pose a question. Mr. Bond, is it pronounced Ouija or Ouija? Well, that's no help at all. In Brooklyn's historic Greenwood Cemetery is this curious sight. It is known as the Grave of Secrets, so named because it features a slot into which visitors can slip their darkest, deepest secrets, written on sheets of paper. What was my secret? I'll take that one to the grave. Hang on, I hear something coming from within the Grave of Secrets. It sounds like music. Leslie Nielsen was a master of comedy, remembered for films like the Naked Gun series and Airplane. He continued to make us laugh right up until the end, but Leslie ensured the laughs wouldn't die with him, leaving us one last joke here on his grave. It's quite common to see the letters RIP on a grave marker. Rest in peace, right? Well, usually. But Mr. Nielsen's epitaph, "Let her rip," means something entirely different. Throughout his later life, he was known for his love of a good fart joke. He even carried a little fart machine around with him wherever he went, so he could let one rip whenever it was most comedically expedient.
It's just a prop. We use it in an airplane, and I have so much fun with it, so I just carry it around with me.
Yeah, okay.
This unique urn in the Abbey of the Psalms at Hollywood Forever Cemetery belongs to actor John Paragon. If you grew up watching Pee-wee's Playhouse in the 80s and 90s, you'll recognize this as an exact replica of the genie box of Jambi the Genie, who would grant Pee-wee one wish per day. After John passed away in 2021, he was cremated, his ashes held for a time by Elvira, until they were placed in this urn. So when you come pay your respects to John, make a wish. Perhaps Jambi will make it come true.
Wish? Did somebody say wish?
Nude statuary is surprisingly commonplace in cemeteries around the world, particularly in Europe and the forest lawns in California. Here is one in Macedon Cemetery in Australia that stands out among the rest. This beautiful sculpture is called Asleep. Lawrence Matheson had been a patron of the artist, Peter Schipperhein, during his life. After he passed, Lawrence's wife commissioned Peter to carve this sculpture to adorn his grave. This monument at Mount Carmel in the Chicago area features a beautiful sculpture of the DeSalvo family. But that's not what makes this unique. This unusual grave marker, with considerable effort, actually rotates on its base. It's known as the spinning grave. Resting in St. Peter's Churchyard in Heysham, England, is Sarah Hannah Jones. All we know about her is what her epitaph states, that she was a poet, philosopher, and failure.
I want something like that on my tombstone.
If you grew up in the 80s, you might just call yourself a fan of Pac-Man. But I'd wager that Michael Pac-Man Luther was a bigger fan than you. The superfan loved Pac-Man so much, his grave is a recreation of a classic Pac-Man arcade game. At Lone Fir Cemetery in Oregon is this curious marker. This unrecorded and unidentified burial was discovered while digging another grave. A family had purchased 3 adjacent graves in this lot, only to discover that one of them was already occupied. Rather than disturb the grave, the new owners moved one plot south. And since the cemetery was unable to identify the remains here, they installed a marker for this random person. Powerful words from a gay Vietnam veteran. The gay community has almost never seen itself reflected in public monuments, particularly funerary monuments. So in 2002, an artist named Patricia Cronin created America's first funerary monument to same-sex marriage, titled Memorial to a Marriage. The sculpture features the artist and her now wife, and was created in a time when same-sex marriage was still illegal in the United States. Originally carved in marble, this more robust bronze version now marks the future graves of Cronin and her wife, here at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York. What may be unusual for one culture may be perfectly normal, even sacred for another. For some Native American tribes, from the Great Plains all the way to Alaska, there is the unique tradition of building a small house over the grave of the departed. Known as a grave house or spirit house, they serve as a temporary home for the spirit of the departed. The structures are typically allowed to decay naturally, as the house is only temporary, until the spirit can move on in their journey into the afterlife. Legendary actor Will Sampson, famous for his role in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was a member of the Muskogee Nation, and his grave here in Oklahoma features a spirit house. In a similar spirit as these Native American spirit houses are dollhouse graves, usually built by parents in mourning for a child who had died. One such example can be found here in Oakwood Cemetery in Lanett, Alabama. Little Nadine Earls wanted a dollhouse for Christmas, but the young girl fell ill and died just before Christmas. Her grief-stricken parents fulfilled her wish, in the form of this dollhouse over her grave, in which she will live forever. Peek through the window and you'll catch a glimpse of the grave of little Nadine Earls, her grave attended by her doll collection and other toys. In Arlington, Indiana, we pay a visit to the rural Arlington East Hill Cemetery to find another of these most melancholy of monuments, the dollhouse grave of Lova Klein. The young girl was born with a crippling neurological illness. During her short life, she loved the dollhouse her father had built for her. After her death at age 6, her father had the dollhouse placed next to her grave, so she could see it always, as well as her toys therein. Just 30 minutes away, in Connorsville City Cemetery, is a similar site. The story of little Vivian May Allison echoes that of Nadine Earls. Her parents had been building a dollhouse for her for Christmas, but young Vivian fell ill and died before they could give it to her. She was just 5. In their grief, they had the dollhouse placed over her grave, filled with her favorite toys. Vivian's parents took care of the dollhouse grave until their deaths, after which it gradually fell into disrepair. Volunteers and citizens of Connorsville stepped in and repaired and refurbished the dollhouse in the 1990s and help maintain it to this day. We spend a lot of time in graveyards, cemeteries, mausoleums, and cathedrals. You ever get sick of it? Me neither. But just for kicks, let's find some graves outside of our normal haunting grounds. In Devon, England, there is a grave. Not in a graveyard, but in an intersection on the side of the road. This is the grave of Kitty J. Much like the grass that blankets it, a lot of folklore has grown out of Jay's grave. But the crux of the story is that a woman named Anne J., or Betty Kay, committed suicide by hanging in the late 18th century. Because suicide was considered a sin, she was denied a Christian burial in the consecrated churchyards, so she was buried instead here at a crossroads. Travelers who drive along this road at night have claimed to see a ghostly figure in their headlights as they pass by Jay's grave. In the mountains outside of Sagada in the Philippines is a curious sight: coffins hanging from cliffs. In this unique millennia-old tradition, the dead here are placed inside wooden coffins, but instead of being buried, they are nailed into walls inside caves or high on cliff facades. This is done to get them closer to their ancestral spirits, high above. This is the London Palladium in England. Over the decades, some of the biggest names in entertainment have performed on this stage. And one of the big names who became closely associated with this stage now rests under it. Bruce Forsyth was an entertainer and presenter whose career spanned some 70 years. He's remembered as host of Sunday Night at the Palladium and a number of game shows. After his death, he was cremated, his ashes entombed underneath the stage here at the London Palladium, eternally resting enveloped in the sounds of music, laughter, and dancing. Exactly where he would want to be. In Volume 1 of our Strange and Unusual Tales, we shared with you stories of individuals who'd had portions of their cremated remains launched into space. Well, there are more stories of individuals whose remains did not remain earthbound. Clyde Tombaugh was an American astronomer known for discovering Pluto in 1930. After his death in 1997, at age 90, a portion of his ashes was placed in this canister aboard NASA's New Horizons spacecraft and launched into space in 2006. In 2015, New Horizons, with Tombaugh's ashes aboard, executed a close flyby of the very planet, now dwarf planet, that he discovered, Pluto. Since then, New Horizons has continued to travel into deep space at a rate of about 300 million miles per year, and is currently more than 5 billion miles from Earth, making Clyde Tombaugh's the most remote grave in the galaxy, and the human that has traveled further than any other in history, alive or dead. In Volume 1 of our Strange and Unusual Tales, we also introduced you to the Neptune Memorial Reef, the world's first underwater cemetery, a man-made reef and columbarium beneath the waters of the Atlantic. We also mentioned how famed chef Julia Child had chosen the Neptune Memorial Reef as her final destination. Well now, thanks to our friends at Eco Photo Explorers, we can show you Julia Child's underwater grave. Julia Child was a cooking instructor, author, and television personality who rose to fame with her cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and subsequent television series, The French Chef. Julia died from kidney failure at age 91. She was cremated, her ashes mixed with cement and molded into this starfish before being laid to rest here on the reef, 40 feet below the surface of the ocean. Julia loved cooking with fish and will spend eternity swimming with them.
Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Today we're going to do fish soup and bouillabaisse.
Julia now herself a key ingredient in this bouillabaisse of underwater life and death. We've voyaged into outer space and dived down into the deep blue sea, but there's one remote locale we've yet to reach, Antarctica. If you can believe it, there are a number of graves on this icy continent. The first known individual to be buried in a grave here on Antarctica was a scientist by the name of Nikolai Hansen. In 1899, while part of an expedition here, Nikolai became ill with an intestinal disorder and requested that should he die, he be buried there in Antarctica. And so he was. The frozen ground made for difficult grave digging, so dynamite was used to blast a hole into which Nikolai was interred. Till death do us part. Not so fast. These next folks might have something to say about that. We begin our exploration of undying love at the old cemetery in the city of Roermond in the Netherlands. This cemetery was established in the late 18th century with clear religious divides. High walls separate sections for Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. Colonel Jacobus Warnerus Constantinus van Gorkum was a Protestant. His wife, Josephina Carlina Petronella Hubertina van Afferden, was a Catholic. A pairing that would have been quite the scandal in that era. Colonel van Gorkum died in 1880 and was buried on the Protestant side of the wall. But his wife knew that when she died, she could not be buried next to him, as she was a Catholic. Before her death, Josephina came up with an ingenious and endearing solution. She had Jacobus buried right next to the wall on the Protestant side. When she died 8 years later, she was buried directly across the wall from her husband on the Catholic side. Their headstones were made to tower over the wall, a pair of hands reaching out of the headstones and clasped together forever across the wall, linking these two graves into one. It's become known as the grave with the little hands. Proof once more that love can conquer all. This Dutch couple wasn't the only one religion tried to separate after death. We travel now to the Royal Chapel of Dreux in France, the traditional burial place of prominent members of the House of Orleans. It was built in 1816 and is notable for the recumbent effigies of those resting therein. Most curious among them is the story of this couple, Prince Ferdinand Phillip, Duke of Orleans, and his wife, Duchess Helene Louise von Mecklenburg-Schwerin. After the Duke died in a carriage accident at age 31, he was laid to rest here in the Dreux Chapel. 16 years later, his wife Helene died. But she, a Protestant, was denied entombment here in the chapel alongside her husband, as it was consecrated for Catholics only. To accommodate her, she was entombed in a room with a separate entrance adjacent to the chapel. Her effigy can be seen through a small window separating the two rooms. The sculptors carved eternal longing into the stone. The Duchess's head turned toward her husband as her hand reaches out for him through the window that separates the two rooms. Her hand piercing this arbitrary divide, extends into the chapel in which she was denied burial because of her faith, agonizingly close to touching the hand of her beloved, but forever out of reach. 3 in 1 casket. That was the headline for the obituary of the Keller family. Maria Keller suffered from mental illness and was briefly hospitalized for the illness. A short time after her release, she shot and killed her husband Emil and their infant daughter Anna. She then took her own life. In the face of this tragedy, it was decided that the small family would be buried together, literally. All 3 were placed in the same casket and buried embraced in each other's arms here at Fort Hill Cemetery in New York. The stone reads in German, Emil, Maria, and Anna Keller, rest here in peace. By the hand of their mother, their fate was decided. And recently, a marker to their other daughter, Verena, who had died a few years earlier, was placed here. Jonathan Reed was eternally devoted to his wife Mary. After her death in 1893 at age 58, she was laid to rest in this tomb built for her by her husband. Unable to let her go, perhaps convinced she was still alive, Jonathan filled the tiny space within the tomb with items from their life together. Paintings, books, bric-a-brac, a rocking chair, a furnace for warmth, even their pet bird. It soon became transformed into a veritable living room into which Jonathan himself moved. He lived for the next decade or so right here in the tomb with his deceased wife, going home at night only to sleep because he was not allowed to stay the night. Here he would eat all his meals, carry on conversations with his wife, and even host guests who came to visit him here at the Evergreens Cemetery in New York. One afternoon in 1905, Jonathan was found motionless on the floor of the tomb, having suffered a stroke. He was taken to the hospital, then a sanitarium, where he died a short time later. He was then finally entombed in this afterlife home he had created for his wife and himself. What's the longest you've ever held a loved one in an embrace? However long, I guarantee you this next couple has you beat. We're in Mantova, or Mantua as we know it in English, a city that served as part of the backdrop of Romeo and Juliet. In 2007, something of a Stone Age Romeo and Juliet was unearthed outside this city. A pair of human skeletons, a young male and female, locked in a loving embrace for the past 6,000 years. Their gaze is fixed on one another. They are known as the Lovers of Valdaro, and their skeletons are now on permanent display at the Ducal Palace of Mantua. If the aforementioned stories of love transcending death warmed your hearts, this next one might give you chills, despite taking place in sunny Key West, Florida. This story concerns one Karl Tanzler, aka Dr. von Kossel, a German immigrant who perhaps fancied himself something of a Dr. Frankenstein. He was working as a radiology technician when he fell in love with a young tuberculosis patient, a Cuban-American girl named Elena Hoyos. Despite not being an actual doctor, Tanzler tried all sorts of means to cure her, from X-rays to a variety of medicines. During this time, he professed his love for her and doted upon her with gifts of clothing and jewelry. But he could not save her, and Elena died in 1931 at the age of 22. Karl Tanzler commissioned the construction of Elena's tomb at Key West Cemetery, where he would visit her nearly every night. But 2 years later, people observed that Karl suddenly stopped visiting the tomb. Had he died? Had he moved on? No, the answer is quite a bit darker than that. Believing Elena's spirit had called to him to take her from the tomb, Karl crept through the cemetery one night and removed Elena's corpse, taking it back to his home in a toy wagon. There in his makeshift laboratory, he attempted to restore Elena to life. Decay had already set in, so he used glass eyes, mortician's wax, wires, and plaster of Paris to attempt to restore her, not to mention copious amounts of perfume to mask the odor. Karl lived with his doll, the corpse of Elena, for the next 7 years, continuing his experiments to bring her back to life so they could fly away together in a plane he was building. He would serenade her with organ music, buy her clothing, even dance with her. But his behavior roused suspicion, And Carl was eventually confronted by Elena's sister, who discovered the horror. Carl was arrested, and Elena was reburied at Key West Cemetery in an undisclosed location, so he could not find her and disturb her again. Fragments of her original tombstone can be seen at the Martello Museum in Key West. And for the rest of his life, Carl made do with a death mask and effigy of Elena that he had made, which was found by his side when he died years later. Are you afraid of death? Does the thought of a long dirt nap send shivers down your spine? Or perhaps you've awoken in a cold sweat from a nightmare of being buried alive, of premature entombment. Well, you're not alone, and these fears have a name. Thanatophobia and Taphophobia. Let's explore these fears together. Edgar Allan Poe once wrote, "The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins?" Before the advent of modern science and medicine, there was the terrifying possibility that someone would be declared dead who wasn't actually dead. And some religious and societal norms often required burial within a very short time of the declaration of death, before the onset of decay. This led to the very real fear of being buried alive, of being in a deep comatose state only to awake in the impenetrable and suffocating dark of a claustrophobic tomb. This fear was especially palpable in the Victorian era, when during the Industrial Revolution, death-like illnesses spread in increasingly dense city populations. This fear was aptly illustrated in Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Premature Burial. If you suffer from taphophobia, fear not, for Albert Fear Not has the solution. In response to the very real fear of being buried alive, safety coffins were devised, a popular version of which had a string attached to the hand of the buried that would ring a bell on the surface if moved. In 1882, Albert Fear Not applied for a patent for a similar safety measure in which a string was attached to the arms of the entombed that if moved would release a spring mechanism that would raise a flag on the surface and open an air vent. I don't see a flag or air vent here at Mr. Fear Not's grave in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, so we can assume he didn't meet such a terrifying fate. One of the most curious case studies in taphophobia is that of Dr. Timothy Clark Smith. Deathly afraid of being buried alive, Timothy devised a very special grave for himself here at Evergreen Cemetery in Vermont, in the event of his death. He would have a rope attached to his wrist which would reach to the surface and ring a bell and signal for help in case he woke up in the grave. But most distinctively, his coffin, specifically his face, was placed directly beneath a 6-foot deep cement tube that led to a window on the surface. This would allow him to see to the surface if he woke up in the grave, and visitors to peek down to see if he was somehow still alive. The tunnel has since become overgrown with grass, so no more FaceTime with Dr. Smith. But the next time you visit a cemetery, listen for the sound of a ringing bell, or take a peek through an odd window. Someone might still be alive down there. Little Merritt Beardsley was afraid of the dark. When he died in 1865 from an illness at just 8 years old, his last wish was to have a window in his grave, so he wouldn't be left in the dark. His father fulfilled that wish, building a window into his tomb here in Oxford, New York. Oh, hello. Looks like in addition to sunlight, he has some company in the form of a couple of mice. So not only does little Merritt Beardsley never have to be afraid of the dark, he never has to be alone either. If you were to be buried alive and didn't happen to have a window like young Merritt, you'd quickly realize that there in the impenetrable dark, this chamber has no windows and no doors, which offers you this chilling challenge.
To find a way out.
Well, if you're Agnes Paulson, buried at Hutchinson East Side Cemetery in Kansas, you may just have the solution. Behind Agnes's tombstone is what appears to be an escape hatch, just in case she needed to find her way out after being buried. Few people who've been buried alive have lived to tell the tale. We travel now to Lurgan, Northern Ireland, and Shankill Cemetery. Herein we find a grave with a most curious inscription: Marjorie McCall, lived once, buried twice. What sort of nightmarish scenario prompted such an epitaph? As the story goes, in 1705, Marjorie fell ill with fever and soon succumbed to her illness, or at least appeared to have. After a brief wake, Marjorie was buried in Shankill graveyard. That evening, before the dirt had settled, grave robbers paid her a visit. They were after the valuable gold ring she was wearing when interred. They dug up and opened the coffin and began attempting to pry the ring from her finger. But from her illness, her fingers had swollen and they were unable to remove the ring. So they resorted to attempting to cut off her finger to pry the ring loose. As soon as the blade pierced Marjorie's flesh, she revived from her comatose state, sat bolt upright, and let out a horrific scream, like the wail of a banshee in the dead of night. The grave robbers ran in terror from the sight, and a short time later, the groggy but still very much alive Marjorie stumbled her way home. Back at her home, her husband John and children were mourning, when there came a rapping at the door. John exclaimed, "If your mother were still alive, I'd swear that was her knock." Sure enough, when John opened the door, there she stood before them. Marjorie made it out alive, but according to this next urban legend, Juliethepearl was not so lucky. We're in Edisto Island in South Carolina and the quiet graveyard of the Presbyterian Church. There's a reason this family mausoleum has no door. Juliethepearl was just 22 when she was struck with a death-like illness in 1852. Her family held vigil for days, but she succumbed to her illness and her body was placed in this family mausoleum. The story that follows is likely the kind of myth that makes for a great ghost story, but isn't rooted in much fact. Regardless of veracity, it's one of those old American paranormal tales that has cemented itself in our folklore. The legend states that years after her entombment here, the tomb was opened once again for its next occupant, likely her son Hugh, who died 2 years later. To their horror, the family found crumpled next to the door a pile of bones in Julia's burial dress. She had been entombed alive, and her attempts to escape had been blocked by the heavy stone door of the tomb. Julia was then reburied alongside her son, but from then on, the door of the tomb would not remain shut. Any attempt to close it would only find it open again later on. The spirit of Juliethepearl, they say, would not allow the door to be shut, never again wanting to feel trapped in the way she had been. And so the door was permanently removed, and the mausoleum remains open for the spirit of Julia to be free. Many of us try and stay close to our dead in thought and spirit. But here in Chapter 8, we try to get a little closer, piercing the veil of earth and concrete that typically separates us from our dead. Florence Irene Ford was just 10 years old when she died from yellow fever. The little girl had been terribly afraid of storms when she was alive. When her grief-stricken mother laid her to rest here in Natchez City Cemetery in Mississippi, She had a casket constructed with a glass window close to her head, and a stairwell leading down to her grave, so that when a storm came, she could descend and comfort little Florence through the window during the storm. In the 1950s, the glass window was covered with a concrete wall to prevent vandalism. To this day, gifts are left for the little girl. Weep not, for in beauty transcendent your daughter doth shine. Giulietta is known as the Italian bride. The young woman died in childbirth in 1921 at the age of 29. She was buried in her wedding dress here at Mount Carmel Cemetery in the Chicago area. Years after Julia's death, her mother began having dreams of her daughter telling her she was still alive. The dreams soon became nightmares, and her mother secured permission to have her daughter exhumed. Julia's coffin had decayed, but when it was opened, onlookers marveled at the state of Giulietta. Though entombed for 6 years, she appeared almost just as she had on the day of her funeral, with almost no signs of decay. A photo was taken of Julia before she was reburied, which now adorns her monument. Let's hop on a plane now to the home of Hollywood Graveyard's composer, Maestro Giuseppe Vasapoli. Among the curious sights you'll see around Europe that are unheard of in the States are catacombs with human remains on display. One of the most famous catacombs in the world is right here in Palermo, on the island of Sicily in Italy. Welcome to the catacombs of the Cappuccini monks. As early as the 1500s, monks began to lay their own to rest in catacombs beneath the monastery, part of an ancient cave structure. In doing so, they found that many of them became naturally mummified, almost perfectly preserved. Believing it to be an act of God, instead of burying the remains, they began to place them on display, propped up in niches in the corridor walls. Monks continued the mummification of their own over the centuries, expanding the practice with drying tables, vinegar washings, and even more modern techniques of embalming. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, the site became a popular museum of death, and prominent citizens of Palermo were eventually granted access to the catacombs and the mummification process for themselves after their deaths. It became something of a status symbol to be preserved for eternity and put on display in the Cappuccini catacombs. Mummies are dressed in their Sunday best or the wares of their professional trade. And if you can get past the horror of what you're seeing, it's a fascinating snapshot of life as it was centuries ago, presented by the people who literally lived it. The very last corpse admitted to the catacombs is also the most famous. On December 6, 1920, young Rosalia Lombardo died from pneumonia. She was not yet 2. Her grief-stricken father asked an embalmer to preserve her remains. She was so well preserved that decades later, the little girl looked still alive, as though she were only sleeping. This photo, for example, was taken more than 60 years after her death in 1982. She has become known as the Sleeping Beauty. Adding to little Rosalia's semblance of life is a strange phenomenon that makes her eyes appear to open and close slightly throughout the day, an illusion caused by the fact that her eyes are not fully shut, with light, shadow, temperature, and humidity fluctuations throughout the day facilitating the eerie effect. Another of the most famous catacombs in the world can be found in Paris, France. Down, down, down we go, deep under the city of Paris. Down endless stairways and along endless corridors carved into the rock. Corridors barely taller than you are, the air cooling with every step, reaching 90 feet below the surface. Halt! This is Death's Empire, aka my home turf. Fair warning, the catacombs are not for the faint of heart. The catacombs of Paris are an ossuary that hold the remains of some 6 million individuals. By the late 1700s, cemeteries in the city of Paris began to overflow, causing health and safety concerns. The solution was to move the bones from all of central Paris's cemeteries to an abandoned underground quarry dating back to the 15th century. Little by little, these former limestone quarries began to fill up with the bones from all the cemeteries of central Paris. Initially, the bones were stacked haphazardly, but in 1810, the Inspector General of the quarries decided to develop the area for a museum-like atmosphere and stack the bones in geometric and neat patterns, creating bone walls and formations called hags. The catacombs were then opened to the public and have been a popular destination for the curious thrill-seeker ever since. But keep track of where you're going and where you've been, lest you hit a dead end and add your own to the bones entombed herein. Don't worry, I found my way out. At least, I think I did. Anyway, the stories in this last chapter run the gamut from head-scratching to heartwarming. It's a cavalcade of the cadaverous, a spectrum of the spooky, a panoply of the paranormal, an odyssey of oddities. Let's just call it a menagerie of the macabre. In 1928, a man was found dead along the side of the road in Sabina, Ohio. He had no identification on him, no way of determining who he was. The man was given the name Eugene by police and taken to Littleton Funeral Home, where he was embalmed. Eugene's remains were made accessible to public viewing, resting on a couch in a small shed outside the funeral home, in hopes that someone would be able to identify him. His remains remained on display for decades, with no one able to identify him. He became known as Eugene the Sabina Mummy, and over the years it's estimated that over 1 million people came to see him. But poor Eugene, in addition to becoming something of a sideshow attraction, was the subject of adolescent pranks, his body even being stolen and set on a University Park bench. So in 1964 it was decided that he may never be identified, and it was best to finally lay him to rest, here in Sabina Cemetery, some 36 years after his death. It's common to have one's ashes scattered after being cremated, but the mode of scattering, well, that can vary significantly. If you're Hunter S. Thompson, author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, for example, your mode of scattering came with a bang, literally. At his private funeral in 2005, Hunter's ashes were fired from a cannon atop this tower, accompanied by fireworks to the tune of Spirit in the Sky. In recent years, the more environmentally conscious among us have moved toward the burgeoning green burial movement, returning to the earth in the most natural way possible. Luke Perry was a major television star in the 90s, playing Dylan McKay on Beverly Hills 90210. And his films include Buffy the Vampire Slayer and his final film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Luke left us far too soon, passing away from a stroke in 2019 at age 52. Luke owned a farm here in Van Lear, Tennessee. It was here that he was laid to rest, buried in an eco-friendly mushroom suit. Embedded in the fibers of the suit are mushroom spores, which slowly break down the body while filtering toxins. The process helps provide nutrients to the soil and avoid contamination to plant life, and allowing the body to return to the earth in the cycle of life. In the old burying ground in Beaufort, North Carolina, is a distinctive wooden tombstone which reads, "Little girl buried in a rum keg." The story of this grave takes us back to the 1700s, when an English family named Slow settled in the colonies. Their young daughter grew up in the colonies, but very much desired to see their homeland of England. The mother expressed her concern about the dangerous voyage, but the father promised he would bring their little girl back home. Tragically, the young girl fell ill and died on the journey home from England. Custom in those days was to have those who die on a ship buried at sea, but Father Slow couldn't bear to part with his little girl and break his promise to bring her home to North Carolina. So, with no other way to preserve her body on the long voyage home, he had her placed in a barrel of rum. The mourning parents then buried her here in the graveyard, still encased in the barrel of rum. To this day, visitors leave toys and other gifts for the little girl. One of the biggest names in classic English literature is Bronte. Sisters Charlotte, Emily, and Anne wrote Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, respectively. Patriarch Patrick Bronte actually had 6 children. Tragically, all his children and his wife would die young, all before the age of 40. They were all laid to rest here in the family vault at St. Michael and All Angels Churchyard in Haworth, except for Anne, who died and was buried in North Yorkshire. The Brontes died from a variety of illnesses, including tuberculosis, but all of them exhibited general poor health throughout their lives, despite being comfortably well off. The family lived downstream from this graveyard surrounding the church, and it's been theorized that their drinking water came from springs which were contaminated with rainwater that had soaked through the graveyard. Long-term exposure to bacteria may have rendered them all more susceptible to the illnesses that claimed them so young. Moral of the story? Don't drink graveyard water. Fans of folklore from the American frontier well know the name Jesse James, and the taphophile contingent of that fandom knows that the grave of Jesse James can be found at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Missouri. But did Jesse James really die by the hand of Robert Ford in 1882, as legend states? Yes, but don't tell that to whomever is buried in this grave in Granbury, Texas. According to this legend, Jesse James faked his death and disappeared off to Texas, where he worked for the railroads as J. Frank Dalton, before dying in 1951 at the age of 103, and was really buried here. Post-mortem examinations of Mr. Dalton claimed to show a number of bullet wounds and rope-burn scars around his neck, as one might expect to find on a frontier outlaw. The next odd tale is typed out in a letter adhered right to the urn of the story's subject. In July 1992, cremated remains were found scattered in the hedge in front of Marilyn Monroe's crypt at Westwood Village Memorial Park. A fan, perhaps. The Yardman discovered the cremains and swept them up. In doing so, he found the ID tag within the ashes, identifying them as one Chauncey Hoke, who died in 1989. The ashes were returned to Chapel of the Pines, where he was cremated, and now rest in the vault. Here's a heartwarming story for you animal lovers. It takes us to Edinburgh, Scotland, and back to the 1800s. Greyfriars Bobby was a terrier owned by a man named John Grey. After his death in 1858, John was laid to rest here in the Greyfriars Kirkyard. The funeral procession to the gravesite was led by his dog. From that day on, for the next 14 years, the loyal pup stood guard over the grave of his beloved master. Local residents fed the dog and even built him a shelter because he simply refused to leave his master's grave for any extended period of time. The vigil lasted until Greyfriars Bobby's own death in 1872, at which time he too was buried here in the churchyard, not far from his master. This headstone was placed in 1981, and in 2021, a new statue monument was placed adjacent to the grave. And after you visit the dog's grave, head around the corner for a toast to Greyfriars Bobby at the pub that bears his name. Then watch the movie Disney made about Bobby. We approach our final stop on this journey through the strange and unusual as our train pulls into the station at St. Pancras in London. Just off the station is the St. Pancras Old Church, one of the oldest in England. The graveyard surrounding the church is steeped in history, but the most curious sight you'll see here is a tree. At first glance, perhaps a fairly unremarkable looking ash tree, until your eyes fall to the ground and you see a cluster of hundreds of overlapping tombstones radiating outward from the base of the tree. So how did this unusual sight come to be? In the 1860s, London was expanding its railway lines, part of which would cut through the eastern portion of the graveyard. A young man named Thomas Hardy, yes, the same Thomas Hardy who would become a renowned author, was tasked with overseeing the careful exhumation and relocation of thousands of graves that would be disturbed by the rail line. After the task was completed, there remained hundreds of old tombstones and the question of what to do with them. The tombstones were eventually placed around the base of this tree in this striking radial pattern, and the tree now bears the name of Thomas Hardy. Over the decades, the tree continued to grow, deforming and enveloping the tombstones as it did. But after more than a century and a half of delighting the curious oddity seeker, tragedy struck. In 2014, the tree was infected with a fungus. For a tree, it was a death sentence. In the following years, the tree slowly decayed until it finally fell in December 2022. It was a great loss, but the curious among us are intrigued to see what the future has in store for this historic site. Until then, rest in peace, the hardy tree. Do you hear that music? That means our time is at an end. I thoroughly enjoyed our evening together, and I hope you did too. But don't worry, I'll be back soon. And I'll have more strange and unusual tales to share with you from the graveyard. After I've had a chance to dig them up. Thanks for watching, and stay spooky, my friends. The people who gave support to make Mr. Dark's Neighborhood are the people of this and other YouTube stations, the Jwslubbock Foundation, and generous contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.